Hi, everybody. Welcome back to CMN 153, and this is for our class for Thursday, the 30th, where we are talking about newspapers and magazines. And I have to admit that this section always makes me a little bit sad because I do remember the heyday of both newspapers and magazines, and just the changes that have occurred in my lifetime have been significant enough for me to question, and I suppose you as well, since so many of you talked about misinformation, the role of newspapers and magazines. And when I was teaching this class years ago with earlier editions of the text, these were two separate chapters, newspapers and magazines. They've been combined into one, and I think that says everything about the industry, which is really in free fall right now. They have, of course, gone to a digital transformation, as every media outlet has. Probably too little too late for many newspapers and for many magazines. We're offering content in the early days of the internet for free, and they realized that was not a profitable thing to do, especially because readers and audiences were now expecting this product for free. Some of the major publications were able to establish paywalls successfully. New York Times, for instance, which has over 10 million subscribers. Atlantic Magazine, for instance, which has over a million subscribers. But probably too little too late, because both industries, newspapers and magazines, are in free fall right now. And they've realized that they need to have multiple revenue streams. So you've got something like Wordle or Wirecutter from the New York Times, but even that's not enough to necessarily finance operations. And what are the purposes, if you will, of these operations? To inform? I'm not so sure either newspapers or magazines are really living up to that element. To entertain? Sure. To document historical events? And I'm old enough to remember when a newspaper would actually be a physical object that would be memorabilia, proof of a particular time and place. A vehicle for democracy? Journalism is protected by the U.S. Constitution. That said, I don't know how journalism has moved from something that was protected from the U.S. Constitution to where it is now. I have some ideas, and when we get to the journalism section, we'll talk a little bit more about them. And the idea of an advertising platform, this gets us back to the very beginning of the semester, where we were talking about advertising basically financing all media outlets. Should journalism expose corruption in the grandest sense of the word? Sure. And we've got examples of that, but they seem to be more of a past approach to journalistic practices than what we see in the present. We see a lot of political and social indoctrination in the present. We see a lot of sensationalism in the present, though sensationalism has existed probably since the beginning of both media vehicles. There was something called yellow journalism. It's a term from the first newspaper comic strip, The Yellow Kid. Basically, it just means where stories would be fictionalized, sensationalized in order to gain readers. And this is something also we will talk about when we get to the movie section. The history, at least of newspapers, probably the beginning of time, when you've got town criers, where you've got news sheets in BC Rome. Colonial newspapers probably were the United States' first examples of early newspapers. Of course, the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s changed everything, not just for books, which we talked about in a previous class, but it made something like the newspaper industry a mass media vehicle. It is becoming increasingly difficult to find trustworthy news. You should question everything. And that said, my go-to is the Associated Press. It was the first major wire service in 1846 that was based on 6 New York newspapers. It went from telegraph to radio waves to now digital transmissions. I've found the Associated Press to be fairly neutral, though I guess there's no such thing as neutrality since we all have bias. And when we get to the magazine history, magazines probably are in a unique place to reinvent themselves. The paper is higher quality, obviously, so it's meant to withstand time, though magazines have also needed to make a digital transformation. If you think about what the world was like before the internet, I suppose I could say that magazines were the closest things to our having an internet. It was a visual medium, it was able to combine text and images, and it could be geared towards very specialized demographics. The word magazine comes from France, 1740s magazine, which means a storehouse for information and also, I guess, for advertising. Developed slowly in colonial America. Mostly it was for the educated, politicians, merchants, and so forth. Initially text driven and then visually driven. I can say that the same thing happened with the internet. It was a first text driven vehicle, then it was a visual medium, and then of course it incorporated audio and video as well. And once again, the Industrial Revolution made magazines, just like newspapers and books, a mass media. Different kinds of magazines that could cross the border into, let's say, newspapers. Photojournalism, where photos were documenting historical events. Life magazine is a great example of that. However, newspapers tended to shy away from reporting real news, and magazines tended to shy away from reporting real news, in part just because it wasn't popular. So part of it is about the appetite of the consumer. To give you an idea, the appetite of the consumer in the mid 1900s, Reader's Digest was the number one magazine. Reader's Digest basically was a publication that condensed major forms of literature. So instead of reading Hamlet, you could read the condensed version of it in Reader's Digest and say that you had, quote, read Hamlet. This had the highest U.S. and also global circulation. That was replaced by, of all things, a magazine called, and I think it still exists, the TV Guide. And this gets us into media convergence, where we've talked about different forms of media overlapping one another. And specifically, this would be changing the face of media because of a man named Rupert Murdoch. And this is a name that we will be revisiting over the course of the semester. Australian. And in the late 1980s, he purchased the TV Guide. And the TV Guide was really the only source at that point to be able to get television programming. And at that point, television was the major media vehicle, as we will discuss. So masses of individuals were watching similar programs at similar times, which led to a sense of community, but also it was a very broad-stroked approach to providing information and entertainment to the masses. Rupert Murdoch wanted to enter the television business, and at the time, the television business was dominated by three major networks: ABC, NBC, CBS, as we will talk about when we talk about TV. All three had started as radio stations, which we will talk about when we discuss radio. It was thought that the big three, which was, I suppose, a kind of monopoly, if you want to think about it that way, would dictate all of television programming, and there wasn't any way to break through with the big three. There were some other minor local channels, and there was also a public broadcasting system. But basically, it was ABC, NBC, CBS. Rupert Murdoch in the late 1980s created a station called Fox. And the idea that Fox could be included in the TV Guide seemed impossible, except Rupert Murdoch owned the TV Guide by this point, and he made sure that Fox listings were included in the TV Guide. One of those television shows still exists, if you know The Simpsons, which happens to be the longest running animated television show in the history of television. But nevertheless, once he was able to establish a television network, he was able to establish cable networks. And he was perhaps most famous for Fox News, which we will talk about in the journalism section. So, in terms of going back to magazines, what are the most popular magazines today? If you can see in the notes below in the fourth section, I've included a link about the 50 most popular U.S. magazines in 2026 that I asked you to look at. Of course, popularity is subjective. We have to think about how we're going to measure that. Is it circulation or the number of copies? Is it readership or the number of consumers? Or reach, which is the number of consumers across different platforms, because we know that everything's needed to move digitally. However, still at number one, and it's been there for quite a while, is AARP magazine, which is for retired individuals. And if you think about that specific demographic, perhaps it makes sense, because that demographic grew up with newspapers and grew up with magazines, and perhaps that way of receiving information still feels comfortable, whether it be print or online or some combination thereof. There still are tabloids, and tabloids are accepted by neither the newspaper industry or the magazine industry. It's a tabloid is kind of a combination of the two, and it's known for its sensationalism, though I can say that major news outlets are looking more and more tabloid-like. There are magazines that have specific demographic editions, special editions targeted to a particular group. Those have probably done a little bit better than general interest magazines, because again, the magazine has really been supplanted by the internet, where you can find information on niche demographics. Webzines, I remember this was quite the thing in the early days of the internet, where a magazine would be exclusively online. And book zines have done pretty well, special editions on a single topic, and they're meant to be preserved. So we know some of the tech mongols today. And when I say names like Zuckerberg, or I say names like Musk, you probably have an understanding of what I'm talking about. In the late 1800s, those were media moguls, and they were named Joseph Pulitzer, of the Pulitzer Prize, by the way, because he wanted to rehabilitate his reputation at the ending of life for being a philanthropist. William Randolph Hearst as well, and he was particularly important, and we will talk about him when we get to the movie section, but basically owning lots of different kinds of media, so basically controlling the message to the masses. And then eventually that led to change with companies owning multiple publications. The Hearst Corporation, notice named after William Randolph Hearst, is a great example. And Rupert Murdoch is another example from the late 1900s. What should be in the news? Of course, this is up to debate. Usually it's something that's timely. Usually it's something that's nearby. It has proximity. More often than not, it's about conflict. Conflict sells. Fear sells. But fear interferes with reasoning, so you've got to be very careful with that. Prominence, though news organizations, magazine organizations are oftentimes determining what becomes the cultural topic of conversation. Some human interest, things of consequence, but of course that can be debated, what does or does not have consequence. Usefulness, and of course that also is in the eye of the beholder, so to speak. Novelty, because people want things that are unusual, and deviant. And I've definitely seen that transformation over the years. So, as I had indicated, journalism is the only media practice and business specifically mentioned and protected by the U.S. Constitution. And you can have two different schools of journalism. One is story driven, where you dramatize important events. The other is trying to be more objective, though complete objectivity is probably an impossibility. The New York Times had the record of being, or had the distinction of being the newspaper of record back in the 1990s, for instance. This is where you might have heard of the 5 W's of journalism: the who, what, when, where, why. This sounds familiar. We talked a little bit about perhaps utilizing these questions for a final project. Investigative journalism started really in the 1800s. Nellie Bly, a very famous reporter, that she reported mental institution abuses by actually having herself committed into a mental institution. But probably the best example of investigative journalism that I can highlight, which occurred in the 1970s, was the Watergate scandal in the Washington Post. So, if you are familiar with the Watergate scandal, basically it was a political scandal about the Republican Party that was audio taping the Democratic Party, and it led to basically the fall of a president, Richard Nixon, at the time period, who was pardoned by the next president for the welfare of the country as a whole, to save democracy. It was quite the scandal, and it was exposed through the Washington Post. So if you've ever heard of a movie called All the President's Men, then that is a dramatization of what happened. There was a leak within the White House, and that leak was giving information to reporters in the Washington Post, and that's how this story exploded into such a scandal. At least it was a scandal in the 1970s. My suspicion is that if something similar happened today, it would not necessarily even be that newsworthy, which goes to show how things have changed over just a few decades. There is literary journalism, where you've got literary elements associated with storytelling. USA Today, which at one point was the #1 publication, where it focused on visuals. Very clever marketing technique that they utilized in the 80s and 90s, where they would have basically newspaper kiosks, places where you could buy physical copies of newspapers that look like television screens. And again, they were trying to jump on the coattails of the popularity of the medium of television. Of course, now we know how online news has democratized news, but it also has led to questions about the validity of information because there are no longer gatekeepers. National news used to be more conflict oriented, and local news used to be more consensus oriented. I think I would say that both now are more conflict oriented because that's what sells. Satirical news, it's fake, yet it's not real. So in 2009, there was an online cable show called The Daily Show. It might still be on, actually. Time the host was Jon Stewart, and he would take real news events and make them into comedy stories, but they would also have validity to them. At one point in 2009, he was voted by Time magazine, which again goes to show the influence that magazines used to have, as the most trusted newscaster in an online poll. And of course, as Jon Stewart said, he was a newscaster, he was a comedian, but this is where people were getting their news. Now, of course, people are getting their news through social media and through lots of other online venues. Of course, we know that there are things like alternative presses where you've got non-mainstream. Again, the internet has really risen as being able to give the disenfranchised voice. We have nonprofit press that's community-based, and this is problematic with the model of generating profit, as we will see in a video I'm going to ask you to watch. And of course, we've got now what's known as a vertical press, niche interest digital sites with bundled related content. So, some of the many issues associated with newspapers and magazines is the ethnocentrism that is associated with America. even in global newspaper and magazine circulations. As many of you indicated in your discussion forum responses, misinformation and fake news. Citizen journalism is a double-edged sword. Partisanship, which we will definitely talk about when we talk about the journalism section. Ethics, and of course, now that we're in the world of AI, ethics have become increasingly muddled. The way that these media organizations determine our cultural agenda. And there is such a thing as news deserts, communities with no reliable news source. That's the key, a reliable news source. So I've got 2 videos for you to watch. One is the news industry's demise, what you don't know. It came out in 2024. It is 12 minutes long. It talks a little bit about these news deserts and about how corporations have basically been taking over the role of reporters. What happened in 2026, so this is recent, seemed impossible, but it happened nonetheless. Sweeping layoffs at the Washington Post. Remember the Washington Post, which was basically responsible for uncovering the Watergate scandal? This video is 7 minutes long, and it talks about how the newspaper industry and just the entire media structure that used to exist is struggling. So there's lots of questions that I could have asked for the discussion forum today, but I thought I would take a quote from our textbook. And the quote is, while many readers shifted from print to digital formats, and then increasingly to mobile, many others fell away from publications like newspapers and magazines entirely. And many young readers never took up the habit of reading them in the first place. So why do you think this is the case? Again, this is somewhat speculation. I know that the newspaper industry and the magazine industry is struggling with trying to find answers for this. And if you were to just go online, you'll see lots of articles and videos about things like, is the newspaper industry or is the magazine industry dead, or can it reinvent itself? So it's a question of speculation now for the industries themselves, let alone for us. But I'm curious to know as to what your opinions are. Again, they are opinions. Feel free to ask family, friends, so forth and so on. That's part of the fun of the class. In terms of your discussion forum response, you are not required to respond to your peers, but you certainly are encouraged to respond to your peers. You are required to read your peer responses and my responses in turn. And now I'm at the point of the semester where I am going to be evaluating your journals and start returning them back to you. And as you know, the journals are basically just an informal response of approximately a page or so about the topic of media that we happen to be discussing in the previous class. And there are no guidelines as to how to go about doing that. You can talk about some of the information in the text. You could talk about some of what I discussed in the class videos. You can talk about some of your own experiences with that particular media vehicle. So there are lots of different ways to proceed. I think of a journal as a diary, but rather than writing about your personal life, you are writing about media. And I'm not evaluating it for grammar or mechanics, just for content, and basically very informally on a check mark system. So a plus is excellent, a check plus is very good, and a check is satisfactory. That's where most of the grades fall. And certainly you can do more than a page or less than a page, however much you want to do. But by the ending of the semester, what you should have is a good overview of all of the major topics that we've talked about in the semester, with some of your reflections and my responses to those reflections, which can be very helpful to you for ending assignments in the semester, such as, let's say, a final exam, an essay exam that will basically be open book, open note, but we'll talk about media in a cumulative way. So basically anything and everything that we've talked about in the class could be discussed in the way that I will phrase the questions. And as you know, I oftentimes like to ask questions that don't necessarily have a clear right or wrong answer. They're not necessarily factually based. And of course, I'm hopeful that you are thinking about a final project, Perhaps there's something that we've already discussed that you think you might want to discuss more in depth in a final project, or perhaps something will be coming up that you would like to discuss in more depth, or something that we won't be discussing that you would like to discuss in final depth or in greater depth. But again, your question for our discussion forum due Saturday, the 1st of August, and if you need an extension, please let me know. According to our text, quote, while many readers shifted from print to digital formats and then increasingly to mobile, many others fell away from those publications entirely. Many young readers never took up the habit of reading them in the first place, unquote. Why do you think that is the case? I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. I'll leave you to watch 2 videos, and we will continue next week. Take care. Bye-bye.